move from global competition to global cooperation. So I just want to, first of all, start at the foundation level, at the very basic level, which is kind of beyond intellectualism, just kind of standing back. So, basically, if we actually look at the Earth, and we just stand back, we get rid of the concepts of left and right, we get rid of the concepts of communism and capitalism. The human-centered economic system, has no relevance to the Earth. I mean, the Earth doesn't even know it exists. So it just reacts to humanity as a whole. So the first slide is really about, kind of just standing back and looking at things with clarity. So we have all these problems going on. And in my view, all these problems, as John was talking about, all these problems are interconnected. And in many ways, what I think the democratic reform movement is doing is moving to what J. Krishnamurti articulated in his lifetime, an Indian philosopher. And his idea was that to solve a problem, you have to look at the problem and understand the problem to come to the solution, rather than having all different theories and ideas and ideological positions. And in many ways, they are the things that actually prevent you from seeing the problem and actually creates the fragmentation and the division in the first place. So in many ways, this is what the democratic reform movement wants to continue, is to articulate people come together to basically, look at the problem. And I want to kind of go really to the very beginning of all this, human thought. It starts with ideas. And, right to the very beginning, if I have an idea, if I have a thought in my mind, and I pass that thought to you, as I'm doing now, pass the thought to you, you have the idea, and, exponentially, this thought becomes collective. So I want to kind of go right to get beyond the academic stuff and kind of just focus on the very basic level of thought, thought passing from one mind to another. And what we kind of think is impossible now can possibly change in the idea that a neoconservative government in America would nationalize banks just months before would have been considered to be, crazy. So what is possible now, could have seemed impossible years ago, and what's possible in the future may seem impossible now. So we've just got to keep an open mind of what may unfold in this decade. So human thought has been evolved, with the tribes, then developed into as John was saying, nation states, feudalism, villages, and now we've got the complex global cities that we have today. And this is going. So it originally started with an epicenter, so to speak, where thought passed from one person to another and expanded outwards from a location, from a center, and basically slowly got to a certain point, and then it stopped, which then developed the nation state. And obviously these locality points were happening all across the world, and this created language and systems of thought that all nations obviously have variations within humanity. So this has been going on, but what's been happening significantly since the Enlightenment period is the basically language that has developed into books, and then the printed press. And this has continued, and it's developed, and consciousness and thought has become more and more non-local, in the sense radio stations no longer have to start from a locality and expand outwards. It can jump on a global level on television and computers. So we've gone from a locality to a non-locality. And now we have a situation like this, where information and ideas are being passed from one another instead of the locality exponentially everywhere at an incredible, at a speed and a level that I don't think human beings can quite comprehend. So it's changing the old idea of linear time in the sense that we are evolving, in a very slow process, 40s, 50s, 60s. And in fact, we're moving to a state now in which change can happen at an incredible speed. And obviously, this is a good example of swine flu. If you look at the way swine flu spread across the world, it didn't start with a locality. It jumped all over the place. And if you compare it to the Black Death, it started with a locality and expanded outwards. So that's kind of a good example of the difference with technology, communication, global travel. And this links into the Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring, is that these have emerged because of this connection to the sharing of ideas from a non-local perspective. And, the idea that would have happened, the Arab Spring would have happened even a year before, to many people would have seemed impossible. So we're living in very unique and different times. So this is kind of what I mean by, to a lot of people, when you say global cooperation, it's so big and it's such a huge idea that it just seems utopian. But I think what we've got to realise is it's not actually a future utopia, it's happening right now. This global interconnection, this global network, systematic network, isn't happening sometime in the future. It's actually unfolding right in present time reality. So that is something I think we have to recognise. And from the 40s, 50s, 60s, as we've gone on, there's been these collective movements. For instance, somebody who wore a bowler hat, say, in the 1950s, would have considered themselves to be an individual who wore a bowler hat, but or a miniskirt in the 60s. But what you really is happening is trends in thinking, in thought systems, in consciousness. So there is, in many ways, waves of consciousness emerging on the planet. And the Occupy movement is a good example of this, because it's created this process. And in many ways, that's another trend. All the kind of moves and all the things that are within that process, are a collective thought system that's developed. So what I'm trying to come across to you with the democratic reform movement is the fact that we need to make this next stage now, where we create a people-centered movement. And this links into nature, because nature does work in a very similar way. It's holonic in the sense it goes from atoms and they come together and create cells and molecules, and so it goes on, as John was saying about nation states and the global situation. And so it's continually going like that. There's no hierarchical process. I mean, the hierarchical process has actually been an artificial development with the development of the nation state. And really, it's a network. And if you look at nature, for instance, one of the most profound principles of life is that of order and cooperation at the higher levels, in the universe, in atoms, in nature, in the human body. So cooperation is embedded in the human form, in all life forms. And as David Corton said, in biological science, it is observed that the earliest colonizing stage of forest system development is dominated by fast-growing, aggressively competitive and transient species that are eventually displaced by the emergence of a more patient, cooperative, settled, energy-efficient species that define the mature phase. So in many ways, that's what humanity is doing right now. Humanity is going through a transition. And let's compare the two models. This is why I don't think it's about capitalism or communism or any ideology anymore. To me, that's the old politics. The new politics is something very different. And compare the two models, very straightforward. The old economic system, or the current economic system, this model divides through destructive competition. Countries are making and selling weapons for profit, which are then used to kill people, protect its own financial self-interests, control over interests of government policy produces debt. Many of the products are produced that intentionally wear out and create toxins. There's great wastage and exploitation of the environment, extremely high levels of inefficiency and consumerism, and it's focused on materialism and the accumulation of things. I mean, these are all very obvious things. I think it's important that we look at the obvious. So the new economics, or the new emergence of this global network, is a higher intelligence in the same way as nature, the higher levels of nature. And an intelligence-based system is a model that encourages social development. And money is created to represent something greater. It's not self-interest, it's without interest, it's connected to a global standard. This model encourages humanity to cooperate. And this sounds all very idealistic, but in many ways this is actually happening right now. It's slowly emerging already. So if you compare the two models, in our hearts, it's not an intellectual exercise. It's an exercise of, intelligence, which is which world do we want? So the fact one, this is not based on any human-created ideology. This is a truth that has been seen by wise and intelligent people throughout human history. And it's a direct reflection of the workings of nature and the universe as a whole. So the current economic system is based on a state of ignorance about life and about nature and the higher principles for that. And we can really look back and see, obviously, there's cooperation going on there. So as John said this earlier, it's a brilliant quote. You cannot solve a problem from the same level of thinking that created it. And that is the thing. The current economic system is the old thinking, fragmented thinking, separate nation-state thinking, corporations competing against one another. That's old thinking. It's old, lower level, beginning of the forest, development level. And the new emergence is recognising that things are naturally and are inherently cooperative. So here we are, we live on one planet, and therefore problems cannot be solved just within the context of nation states, as John said. So we have these thousands and thousands of organisations across the world and millions of people working for the same ethical goal, trying to do what they can to survive, and the pressure of global governance. So these organisations are like weak channels of water separately trying to get their message through a solid economic barrier and red tape. But the thing is what is significant, and I think what's going to happen a lot next year in 2012, is a unification process of all these groups that actually want to achieve the same objectives, like this. So and this links in at the same time. There's a development, and the reason this is going to happen, I think, is because these groups, although they've developed their individual ideas, are recognising that individually they can't actually achieve their objectives. And the present, there's a huge disparity, and that simultaneously there's a huge disparity between the levels of international cooperation of economics and all the institutions, and the increasing global crisis. So, for example, look at the climate change negotiations. From 1992, they've been trying to deal with this. The United Nations have actually, been trying to solve climate change, well, since the 1960s. But this is since 1992, and the problems just increased and got worse and worse. So clearly, something within our mainstream institutions is very wrong. We talk, and yet simultaneously the problems are just getting worse and worse. No matter what they say about the Millennium Development Goals, or what they say about we having this agreement and that agreement, it's actually going the other way. There's an exponential process, especially in climate science, in which there's a constant accumulation of CO2s. There's not a situation where we're cutting greenhouse gases with trading. It's all fiction. The truth is that every car that pumps CO2s out constantly increases it into the atmosphere So we need so this is not really radical, what I'm saying. It's actually essential and vital, and actually the only thing that we can do to survive as a species. So the timescale of the Earth's responses to human activity and the timescale of our human-created institutions that the Earth doesn't recognise anyway are totally incompatible. So we can give these as much authority as we like collectively as human beings, but in reality the Earth doesn't really give a damn about the United Nations. Time is running out. And what's quite interesting is that, you know, we depend on this external authority, the United Nations, our nation states, our governments that we elect. But, you know, there's over 20% of the world that want to actively support real and positive change for the welfare of the whole community. And, you know, this is starting to emerge with things like the Occupy movement. And there's people, you know, throughout human history that have wanted to do that. And it's beginning to, cooperative alliances are beginning to emerge, and humanity working together as a team. So the question is, I mean, I think everyone in this room obviously would answer yes to all those questions. I'm not going to read them out, but, you know, it's clearly obvious that we all, in our hearts and in our minds, want those things. So we all answer yes to those questions, then we're all in this room, we wouldn't have come today if we were not part of the percentage that want to see that positive change in the world. So we all want the same thing. So this is what I think, this is linked into John Bunzel's idea of simple. I think there's going to be a process, especially next year, in which an international ethical authority, and as I say, we have to keep our minds open because it's not going to happen within the old institutions that are connected to nation states and the old separative thinking. It's going to have to emerge totally outside of the mainstream institutions, and it's got to be a process that is people-centred and which goes literally as a groundswell of these organisations and these people, that creates an authority that eventually can go above and beyond the powerful self-interest. I know that sounds radical at the moment, but in many ways it does replicate the workings of nature. And this is what, you know, nature patterns together to create a greater complexity, a greater organisation, a greater self-regulation, and this eventually creates a systematic and harmonised whole called a holon. And you can see that in many ways the pattern of the Occupy movement. I mean, this is all actually factual about what happens in nature. And the Occupy movement is kind of doing that, but the only problem is it's becoming another fragment separate from the whole. So we can, if we really do stand back and we say, how would the proposal of the European Union have been viewed before and during the Second World War, then you would have been laughed at. The idea that Europe would have been unified and then, you know, there'd be no war. So within a matter of years, you know, literally, that was kind of proven to be very different to what people thought. And it's interesting because this has happened before. The International Red Cross developed in a similar way in response to the suffering during the times of war. And if what's interesting about the Red Cross is the Red Cross developed virally, even when there wasn't the ability to really be viral like we have today, and that the action swelled from the compassion of the people, which led to global action to help people in times of war. And I just think it's that we're moving, wise and intelligent people of the world are beginning to connect with one another now and finding each other because of global communication. And, you know, that doesn't rule out intellectualism as well. That's also very important. The two are actually both hand in hand. Thinking and into academia is incredibly important, but it needs to be balanced with a greater sense of wisdom and intelligence. And I think if they come together, ultimately we will create something very different, some kind of cooperative order, which is into the future. I'm not going to go too much into detail on that today. I think that's for another talk. So, I mean, we're all here today because of standing back and we care about where we live and where we are kind of standing right now is kind of there. So I hope you join us and we all work together to make things better. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's not very good technology.